Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to the Informa Pharma Intelligence webinar, Outlook for NASH Therapy and Market Dynamics. I'm one of your presenters today. My name is Joe Haas, and I'm with Informa Pharma Intelligence as a writer for Script and the Pink Sheet, and I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Hannah Cohen, and I work on the cardiovascular and metabolic team as an analyst for Data Monitor Healthcare.
Thanks, Hannah. So let's take a look first at our agenda for today. So we're going to take you through the background of NASH, what the definition is of the disease, its epidemiology, unmet needs, clinical trial landscape, and the FDA approvable endpoints. Hannah's going to review for you research and development, including the timeline of potential approvals and the pipeline landscape. Then I'm going to overview for you business development, including our expectations and predictions, and what companies such as Gilead, Pfizer, Novartis, and others are doing in the space. Then Hannah will take a look at the issues around pricing strategies for NASH, uncertainties in the market, manufacturer pricing strategies, and payer responses. I'll follow that with a look at second-to-market and combination strategies for NASH therapy, looking at who will follow the expected leader into the space, which is Intercept, and how the standard of care might evolve. And then from there, we'll go to conclusions and Q&A. And before we get started, I'd like to let everybody know that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slides will be sent to registrants after the webinar. Questions can be asked at any time using the chat box underneath the media player. And for technical assistance, use the Test Your Connection button. And so now, Hannah, can you get us started on our overview of NASH and what's being done to address it?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joe. So I'll start by talking about why NASH is such a topic of interest at the moment and what is being done to address it. NASH is a progressive form of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and can be defined as the presence of over 5% hepatic steatosis, which is the buildup of fat in the liver, and inflammation with hepatocyte injury with or without fibrosis. Now, although fibrosis is not required for diagnosis, it's present in over 80% of NASH patients, and stages range from F1, being the least severe, to F4, being the most severe, where patients have cirrhosis. NASH is a multifactorial disease with multiple different aspects contributing to the pathophysiology, including hepatic steatosis, inflammation, and fibrosis. So now let's look at the market size of NASH. Our epidemiology analysts at Data Monitor Healthcare have estimated that in 2018 there were 26.2 million diagnosed prevalent cases in the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets. Now, we forecast this to increase by 12.6% to 29.5 million cases by 2038, and this is mainly driven by an increase in the number of US cases. Western diet and a sedentary lifestyle are both thought to be contributors to the increase in prevalence. As well as this, the rise in comorbidities, including obesity, type 2 diabetes, dyslipidemia, and hypertension, are also thought to be contributing factors to the increase in prevalence in NASH. The large NASH market, combined with this ever-increasing prevalence, creates a significant need for treatment, as currently there are no disease-specific approved therapies for NASH. This is also significant as NASH patients have a higher rate of liver-related and non-liver-related mortality compared to the general population. They're also at increased risk of progression to cirrhosis, which is closely associated with end-stage liver disease, including liver decompensation, which often leads to requiring a liver transplant. Hepatocellular carcinoma is another major illness associated with cirrhosis and is one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide. Now, there is a clear significant economic burden on healthcare systems, with NASH thought to becoming the leading cause of liver transplant in the US by next year. Other limiting factors in the market include the lack of an alternate reliable diagnostic tool to liver biopsy. Now, liver biopsy is an invasive and expensive procedure that often carries a small risk of infection. This results in patients being reluctant to undergo it and is increasingly difficult to diagnose patients in a reliable way in order to predict the magnitude of risk of disease progression. As well as this, the large market size in NASH, combined with the limited number of hepatologists that are actually qualified to carry out biopsies, means it's not a sustainable method for diagnosing NASH in the future once the market becomes more saturated with therapies. And therefore, multiple companies are getting involved in developing a non-diagnostic tool. One of these companies that's in a late-stage development is GenFit, which is developing an in vitro diagnostic tool called NAS4, which combines multiple different biomarkers that GenFit have determined best predict diagnosis of NASH. However, having spoken to key opinion leaders, they are still not confident on relying solely on biomarkers to diagnose NASH. Finally, the severe lack in clinical trials in F4 cirrhosis patients is particularly concerning. Companies are appropriately scared off by the fact that cirrhosis has originally been viewed as irreversible. However, the need for a therapy in this patient population is significant, as these are the highest priority to treat, as they are the most likely to progress to liver decompensation and require a liver transplant. However, currently, only Ocaliva is in a late-phase clinical trial for these patients, and given the modest results in F2, F3 patients, we are not confident of success in the F4 patient population. So now moving on to look at a snapshot of how clinical trials have evolved over time. As expected, there's a huge need for a therapy in NASH, and the number of trials has increased drastically in recent years, with large attraction from big pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer, Gilead, and Allergan. Joe, could you please now lead us on to FDA approvable endpoints?
Yes, I can, as soon as I remember to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Because there are no approved drug therapies for NASH, sponsors had no validated pivotal endpoints to use for phase 3 trials. Several years ago, FDA convened meetings with stakeholders to determine what might work as surrogate endpoints to get the first NASH drugs approved. The agency issued guidance last December that formalized 3 surrogate endpoints, which are now being used in several companies' pivotal trials. And those endpoints are as follows. The first is resolution of steatohepatitis on the overall histopathological reading and no worsening of liver fibrosis on the NASH CRN fibrosis score. Resolution of steatohepatitis is defined as absent fatty liver disease or isolated or simple steatosis without steatohepatitis, and a NASH score of 0-1 for inflammation, 0 for ballooning, and any value for steatosis. The second surrogate endpoint is improvement in liver fibrosis greater than or equal to 1 stage, again on the NASH CRN fibrosis score, and no worsening of steatohepatitis. Finally, sponsors do have the option of trying to demonstrate both of these things, so both resolution of steatohepatitis and improvement in fibrosis as defined in those 2 other endpoints outlined above. Intercept Pharmaceuticals initially designed its phase 3 trial for Ocaliva to show both a resolution of steatohepatitis and an improvement in fibrosis. However, after the trial began, they decided to go to an either-or standard, and they eventually had phase 3 data showing that they could reduce fibrosis by 1 stage or greater to statistical significance. When we look at the pipeline, we see just a lot of activity. The pipeline is diverse with numerous players Biomed Tracker is 65 candidates in clinical development. That's almost certainly an undercount because you have privately held companies working in stealth that we don't know about. And in addition to the clinical candidates we've identified, of course, there are also preclinical programs and investigator-initiated trials. It's a very busy space. Our best count right now is that there are 53 companies working on NASH clinical candidates, and 6 of those companies have more than one candidate. Right now, there are 5 drugs in phase 3. Gilead was actually the first company to report phase 3 data with selonsertib. That drug failed its phase 3 trial, and Gilead no longer lists selonsertib as a NASH candidate, although it still is developing it for kidney disease. So we no longer list that among the phase 3 candidates, even though it reported phase 3 data. We also see 40 candidates in phase 2 and another 20 candidates that are in phase 1 or phase 1/2. And now, Hannah, let me turn it over to you for a review of NASH R&D. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Joe. So now we have a clearer understanding of the unmet needs in NASH and an overview of how the pipeline is evolving. We can take a deeper look into who the key players are in the R&D pipeline. There are 5 phase 3 pipeline agents at the moment, including Intercept Ocaliva, which is expected to be approved in Q2 2020 after having just filed for approval with the FDA in September this year, followed by Genfit's elafibranor in Q4 2020 as the first therapy approved to show an improvement in NASH resolution. This could be followed by CVC with approval in Q4 2021, and then Madrigal's resmetirom in Q3 2023, with Galmed's Aramchol entering the market last in the next 5 years in Q1 2024. So let's look at Ocaliva first, as this is expected to be the first therapy approved for NASH and have a great impact on the market. Intercept recently released phase 3 Regenerate data, which was in F2, F3 patients. Efficacy results for Ocaliva are moderate, as it met the primary endpoint of fibrosis improvement with no worsening of NASH, with the highest dose group of 25 milligrams. And there was a dose-dependent effect, which is encouraging. However, it failed to meet the primary endpoint of improvement in NASH resolution with no worsening fibrosis, although there was a slight positive trend in favour of Ocaliva. But as Joe mentioned before, only one of the endpoints needs to be met in order to be considered for FDA approval. So moving on to look at Ocaliva's safety profile, there are several concerns over this, as there was evidence of a dose-dependent increase in pruritus, which is a unpleasant itching effect that patients feel. This led to 9% of patients in the 25 milligram group discontinuing. As well as the increase in pruritus, there was also a rise in the LDL cholesterol levels initially after patients initiated treatment. And although this returned to almost baseline levels by the end of 18 months of therapy after treatment with statins, it's still concerning in a patient population that is at increased risk of cardiovascular events. Physicians are wary of the issues with statin compliance and that they don't translate from the clinical setting into the real world. And this could be a barrier for them prescribing Ocaliva if approved. To combat this, Intercept will likely strive for a dose titration technique, as they did with primary biliary cholangitis, an indication that Ocaliva is already approved in. As mentioned before, Ocaliva is in a phase 3 trial in F4 patients, with enrollment completion expected in Q4 2019. Given the significant unmet need in the NASH space at the moment, we don't expect the safety concerns to initially impact approval, and Ocaliva is expected to experience rapid uptake once approved, holding a dominating position in the market. Intercept have also announced plans for a potential combination treatment with bezafibrate, a pan-PPR agonist. So now looking at elafibranor, it initially failed to meet its original endpoint of NASH resolution with its original patient population that included those with an NAFLD activity score of 3 or above. So the NASH scoring system works by looking at inflammation, steatosis and ballooning, and it's actually thought now that those with a NASH score of 3 are not definitely diagnosed with NASH. Therefore, when using a modified definition of NASH resolution with the adjusted clinical trial enrollment criteria of those with NASH 4 and above, the primary endpoint was met. So it's likely that the NASH 3 patients diluted the results and contributed to the trial failure. There was also a greater response rate observed with the more advanced patients, which is encouraging as this is the target patient population. Elafibranor is in a phase 3 trial with results expected in Q4 2019, and we expect it to experience moderate uptake once approved, taking some market share from Ocaliva given its strong tolerability profile and positive effects on lipids. Galmed have announced plans to launch a combination therapy program looking at an SGLT2 inhibitor and GLP-1 agonist. Allergan's CVC produced less successful results in its phase 2 trial. It failed to meet the endpoint of improvement in NASH and also failed to show a reduction in fibrosis after 2 years of treatment. A phase 3 trial was initiated based on post-hoc analysis that showed pooled results had the greatest impact in F3 patients. However, given that phase 3 trials have the more stringent endpoints, as discussed by Joe earlier, it's unlikely that CVC will succeed as a monotherapy, though there are plans to combine it with Novartis' FXR agonist tropifexor. Madrigal's resmetirom has high potential as it showed robust decreases in hepatic fat that were sustained for the duration of the trial of up to 36 weeks. As well as this, at week 36, 77% of treated patients showed over 30% relative reduction in hepatic fat, which is a very encouraging result. There were also favourable rates of NASH resolution, with highest rates in the MRI-PDFF responders. Resmetirom has a strong safety profile as it exhibited positive effects on LDL cholesterol levels and also did not show any changes to cardiovascular or diabetic biomarkers, which is important to note as thyroid hormone receptors often have unwanted effects on these markers. This shows that so far the resmetirom has proven to be liver selective. It's currently in phase 3 trials in NASH, looking at F2, F3 patients, and we expect that essentially its strong efficacy and safety profile will overcome its late entry to market, allowing it to experience strong uptake, being a serious competitor for Intercept Ocaliva. Finally, looking at Galmed's Aramchol, these results were inconsistent and therefore we consider them slightly concerning. So it did meet its primary endpoint of reduction in hepatic fat, but this was with the lower dose group of 400 milligrams. However, the higher dose group of 600 milligrams showed the higher number of patients experiencing over 5% reduction in absolute change from baseline in liver fat. As well as this, the 600 milligram dose showed the greatest improvements in NASH resolution. Now Galmed are using the 600 milligram dose in its phase 3 trial. However, as you can clearly see, the dosing inconsistencies do suggest that there's a high degree of variability between these patients, and therefore it's unlikely that they will be able to replicate these results in a larger phase 3 trial with harder endpoints to meet. So Joe, could you now talk a bit about the business development in NASH?
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. And by the way, I understand we're getting some questions about the slides, so I'll just reiterate, as I said earlier, that after this webinar, we will be sending a copy of the slide presentation to all attendees. So you will be getting that. So now let's take a look at NASH business development. Currently, as I said before, there are 53 companies with candidates in clinical development for NASH. Our strategic transactions database has recorded 21 deals in the NASH space since January of 2015. That is certainly a low count on the actual deal activity in the space, which has also seen recent deals like Novartis's integrin inhibitor collaboration with Pliant Therapeutics that was announced on October 23rd, and Gilead's biomarker partnership with Glimpse Bio announced earlier this week. We've seen 12 license and option transactions, and we've seen 5 M&As. These have tended to be smaller targeted deals, not the kind of mega mergers we've seen in the biopharmaceutical space like Takeda Shire or Bristol Celgene. Just quickly reviewing the M&As we've seen so far. In 2016, Gilead acquired Nimbus Apollo for $400 million up front. Then in 2016, Allergan made a pair of deals almost simultaneously, acquiring Akarna for $50 million up front, and then acquiring Tabira and with it the candidate CVC for $534 million. Last year, Genentech acquired the startup Jacure, and that the financial details of that transaction were not disclosed. And earlier this year, Altimmune bought Spitfire. That was $5 million upfront in equity with a lot of potential earnouts. We've also seen 3 trial collaborations and 1 technology pact to this point. We don't expect that NASH will drive major M&A right now, but there could be some larger scale acquisitions than the ones we've seen to this point. And one thing we are keeping an eye on is that AbbVie and Allergan, their pending merger, which is currently under review at the FTC, will bring AbbVie into the NASH field thanks to Allergan's programs, and we don't know if that was a driver of that transaction, and we don't know how interested AbbVie is in NASH. However, it's worth noting that AbbVie has significant liver experience because of its success in the hepatitis C space, and you'll see some other successful Hep C companies in the NASH space, notably Gilead. I'd also like to add that in April, Novartis bought the company IFM Tray for $310 million up front. That's not specifically a NASH-related M&A deal, but NASH is one of the diseases they'll be looking at using IFM Tray's inflammasome pipeline. So when we look at some of the individual players in business development, one I always keep an eye on is Gilead, and that's partly because they're sitting on a large pile of cash, estimated at more than $30 billion that they could spend on M&A, and they've already been doing some of that in recent years in NASH and in other spaces such as cancer cell therapy with Kite Pharma. So they've been a frequent deal maker in the NASH space. I mentioned the Nimbus Apollo buyout. They've done a pair of licensing deals, a trial collaboration with Novo Nordisk that people are going to be very curious to see how that turns out, and the recent biomarker partnership on Monday. And my expectation is that Gilead's going to look for a strategic M&A that might replicate the success it had in hepatitis C with its buyout of Pharmaset in 2011. Right now, I would expect that they could be doing some due diligence on either Madrigal or Viking, either of which could add a complementary MOA to what Gilead already is developing in-house. Just to review the Pharmaset deal, back in 2011, Gilead paid $11 billion for essentially a single phase 2 asset, which was sivosbuvir, yet it yielded a substantial multiple on that $11 billion investment as sivosbuvir was approved as Sovaldi, and that drug catalyzed the company's dominance in hepatitis C, both as a solo agent and in several blockbuster combination regimens. Again, I do think NASH is likely too diverse in terms of disease pathology and the patient base to repeat that success, but that doesn't mean Gilead won't try. I also keep an eye on Pfizer and Novartis, two big pharma companies that are working on their own and have also decided to work together to combine their strengths to hopefully come up with perhaps a combination regimen for NASH. So yeah, they're both pursuing multi-candidate, multi-mechanism of action strategies in tandem and separately. Of course, Novartis already has had one disappointment with its purchase of Canatus and Amriccasan. It paid $50 million up front in 2016 for an option to that pan-caspase inhibitor, and then after several trial setbacks, Canatus shelved the drug in June of this year. Pfizer and Novartis signed a trial collaboration toward the end of 2018 under which they'll combine Novartis' tropifexor with 3 Pfizer molecules that all pursue a fat-reducing mechanism of action. It will be hugely influential in the space if these two companies come up with a strong combination therapy comprising just their candidates because of the international commercial heft they could put behind that. When we look at the crowding field, of course, as I mentioned before, AbbVie could be coming into the field through its merger with Allergan, and we see Germany's Boehringer Ingelheim ramping up its R&D efforts in NASH as well. So just to review, AbbVie will be in if the merger with Allergan goes through. However, the viability of CBC is questionable, but AbbVie bringing in its liver expertise thanks to HCV could, bring new life to that compound. We don't know. Boehringer Ingelheim has recently announced a license deal with Yuhan, and they're doing their own internal combination work. The space leaders, Intercept and GenFit, largely have gone it alone to this point. GenFit, of course, as Hannah mentioned, is partnered with LabCorp on its NIS4 diagnostic. It also licensed Chinese rights for elafibranor to Terns Pharmaceuticals in both NASH and primary biliary cholangitis. Intercept, to our knowledge, has not partnered with anyone yet. So that's my review of business development. Hannah, can you take us through what you think are going to be the issues in pricing for NASH?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Joe. So there are no available treatments at the moment, and as a result, payers are essentially not covering expensive costs for NASH patients. Therefore, introducing new drugs into this space will be really difficult, and manufacturers are likely to encounter pushback from payers. To better understand this space, I interviewed a payer in the US, and we discussed the challenges that surround pricing in NASH therapy. So, the future of the NASH market is uncertain, and it's heavily dependent on pricing. There's currently a large debate over what a suitable and sustainable pricing strategy is that satisfies manufacturers, payers, and patients. The lack of an approved therapy creates a high degree of uncertainty over what price the market will be able to bear. As well as this, budget-busting drugs face usage restrictions that will limit impact on payer budgets. A good example to use that manufacturers should learn from is PCSK9 inhibitors that experience severe challenges in terms of market access. These are lipid-lowering therapies, so Repatha and Praluent, which experienced lower than expected market adoption when it initially entered the market, at a list price of over $14,000 per patient per year. Now, the problem was that there was no outcomes data at that time, and they were competing with cheap generic statins that were available in the market. And therefore, payers refused to reimburse them at such a high cost. This led to strict reimbursement criteria that went well beyond the label and severely limited patient accessibility. But even after positive cardiovascular data was released, payer restrictions remained in place. This led Amgen to lower the cost of Repatha, and even though Sanofi and Regeneron had an exclusive deal with Express Scripts for a preferential position in exchange for a high rebate, They found that Medicare D patients, elderly patients, had high copays, which forced them to drop the price as similar to Repatha. Again, manufacturers should learn from this pricing scenario. Otherwise, pricing a NASH therapy too highly could lead to severe patient restrictions, which is particularly important in this space, as there is no other pharmacological option for these NASH patients. So during the interview, we also discussed pricing, barriers to pricing a therapy and why it's so difficult to determine what a suitable and sustainable price is. Firstly, there's no marketed analogues available to act as a price benchmark, which means that payers are going to have to determine what's both an affordable and cost-effective price. Secondly, there's limited epidemiology data, and this is due to unreliable diagnostic tools, as I mentioned earlier. This is significant because the price of a NASH therapy has to correlate with the size of the patient population. In addition to this, there's no formal report on NASH's economic burden on healthcare systems, which leaves it entirely to the payer's discretion alone to determine the value of a NASH therapy. Finally, and perhaps the most important point, is that there's high uncertainty over clinical relevance of surrogate endpoints and how these will reflect on real-world outcomes. So this means that payers are going to have to understand exactly what these surrogate endpoints mean and how it affects hepatic outcomes later down the line to work out if there is actually a downstream saving benefit. So let's look at what the pricing options are. Companies have two options. They can either use a conservative pricing approach aimed at a wider patient population, which will inevitably lead to a more lenient reimbursement criteria. Or they could go for a more aggressive approach aimed at a restricted patient population, which will likely lead to payers implementing a strict reimbursement criteria. It's becoming more apparent that manufacturers will go for the latter, as regulatory bodies are likely to limit the label to use in F2, F3 patients only, as this is reflective of the clinical trial enrollment criteria and is currently the focus of most trials, which is likely thought to be due to the fact that F2, F3 patients are advanced enough that you'd be able to see a treatment effect, but not too advanced that they would be unresponsive to treatment. It's understood that F4 patients are the highest priority. However, without clinical trials in this area, regulatory bodies are likely to wait until proof of efficacy is seen in this patient population. F1 patients are essentially the lowest priority to treat, as they're at lowest risk of developing hepatic outcomes. There'll predominantly be recommended lifestyle modifications, so things like changes to diet and exercise. There's also the issue of compliance, as these patients are asymptomatic with multiple comorbidities, so will be unwilling to add another expensive therapy into their routine. Finally, moving on to what pricing strategy manufacturers are going to use and their justification for this and how payers will respond to it. So manufacturers will argue that they're fulfilling an unmet need and that there's no other pharmacological option for patients to use. As well as this, their therapy is essentially has long-term cost savings through prevention of hepatic outcomes. So this is things like end-stage liver disease through liver decompensation or hepatocellular carcinoma. However, with no clinical outcomes data, payers are going to be less inclined to accept the high pricing, as they have to rely solely on surrogate endpoints. Another argument for payers is that the time frame of disease progression is unclear. So, for example, we do not know how long it will take for an F3 patient to develop a hepatic outcome, be it 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. Now, this is less significant for Medicare plans, but with commercial plans, they have a younger patient population and they have a turnover rate of an average of 2.5 years. So this means that they'll be less inclined to accept the initial high cost as they're less likely to see the downstream saving benefits. Also, manufacturers have to bear in mind that this is a chronic medication, so there's no, patients are taking them indefinitely, and there's a large market size. So looking at how payers will respond to premium pricing, it will likely be in the form of strict reimbursement criteria, which will include prior authorization forms, biopsy-confirmed NASH patients, requiring documented proof rather than physician attestation. Payers are also very aware that F4 patients are the highest priority to treat, and therefore physicians might be inclined to prescribe the newly approved therapy to their F4 NASH patients off-label. As a result, payers will keep the F4 patients off formulary until proof of efficacy in this patient population is seen. A pay-per-performance plan is an option if high pricing is apparent. However, there are restrictions due to logistical barriers. High pricing could lead to a therapy being placed on a specialty tier. Now, this would lead to an even higher financial burden for patients with high out-of-pocket costs and therefore would severely restrict patient access. So we can now understand that there's huge potential for the NASH market to grow. However, aggressive pricing will severely limit commercial prospects, and this is something manufacturers will have to bear in mind when pursuing an aggressive pricing strategy. For the last section, Joe, could you please just discuss who will follow Intercept and what combination therapies are expected in the future?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Hannah. So when we look at who will follow Intercept, we see GenFit, and then we see a multitude of possibilities. GenFit likely will be second to market with elafibranor, or the field is very unclear after that. Right now, I would say there's no clear third place player given the clinical trial stumbles that have been seen by Gilead, by Allergan through its partnership with Tobira, and Novartis and its partnership with Conatus. Madrigal was the fifth company to enter phase 3. They're just underway, and their data is expected in the second half of 2021, so roughly 2 years from now. Galmed moved into phase 3 in September, so they're just getting underway. And then Gilead filed a phase 3 protocol with the FDA in August. We're waiting to see the outcome of that. I'll just add that we, of course, have the U.S. Liver Conference, the AASLD meeting, coming up in Boston starting November 9th. And Gilead is one of the companies I'll be talking to there to get a better sense of their NASH program. So please stay tuned for our coverage of that in Script and the Pink Sheet. So when we think about second to market, it's pretty clear that followers behind the first or the first two entrants are going to have a solid opportunity, and efficacy and safety improvements will be sought pretty much immediately from the initially available therapies. With the size of the patient base here, the fact that NASH is a multifactorial disease, and the likelihood that this will be chronic rather than curative therapy, NASH should offer treatment niches for several mechanisms, therapies, and companies. Intercept expects to have the antifibrotic market to itself for 2 years or more, while GenFit, if they follow Intercept onto the market as expected, will have a NASH resolution claim. Now, I recently had a chance to interview the new GenFit CEO, Pascal Prigent, and we talked about a lot of things, including the fact that he and his team think that because of elafibranor's clean safety profile, they may get to market much closer to Intercept than people are currently expecting, which may be a 12-month gap or something like that is what is being expected. But they think that because of the questions about Intercept's Ocaliva in terms of pruritus and increased LDL levels seen in clinical trials, that there could be pushback from FDA wanting more safety information. So they said they think that they may launch almost in tandem with Intercept. We'll see if that happens. Another interesting thing with GenFit is they're a small clinical stage company based in France, and although they've been building up their U.S. presence through an office in Boston, they have said that they're certainly looking to business development to help elafibranor reach its market potential, assuming it is approved. And they're very agnostic as to how they're going to proceed in business development. They're open to even an M&A. Short of that, it seems like it's very likely that they'll bring in a partner to commercialize elafibranor in the United States. Both drugs, Ocaliva and elafibranor, are thought to offer modest benefit, so the market will seek efficacy advances. And then, as we've talked before, Intercept's tolerability profile also could be limiting for the drug's uptake. My anticipation, having covered the hepatitis C market pretty closely before focusing a great deal on NASH, is that Intercept and GenFit ultimately could end up being kind of like Vertex and Merck were in hepatitis C when they introduced the protease inhibitors Incivek and Victrellis, the first direct-acting antivirals for hep C, back in 2011. These two drugs were quick launches. Incivek was a blockbuster in its first full year on the market, but each drug also saw an equally fast decline, and the two drugs are barely used currently. Vertex launched in 2011, had a blockbuster on its hands in 2012, but was out of HCV by 2014, and now is known primarily as a cystic fibrosis company. So that was a very fast evolving market. This one, maybe not quite as fast, but it'll be hectic. When we talk about others to watch, of course, I mentioned before that I think Madrigal and Viking are two very interesting companies, and they're both working in the same mechanism, THR agonism. So Madrigal has said it's also going to initiate a phase 3 study in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease patients with dyslipidemia in diabetics, and they're pursuing an endpoint of lowering LDL. So, if they can get that as a label indication, that could make them very competitive against Intercept and just very competitive in general. And, they may be going for multiple indications with resmetirom. As I said before, I think Madrigal and Viking both could be M&A targets. Viking is not quite as advanced with its THR agonist. They expect to have phase 2b data for their VK2809 in 2021. Cirrhotic patients will likely be a very important treatment niche, and I know Hannah has told us a great deal about that. Intercept already is targeting a supplemental approval in cirrhotic patients. They have begun the phase 3 reverse trial with Ocaliva in cirrhotic NASH patients, and they expect data readout for that in 2021. That could really give Ocaliva some additional legs in the NASH space if they can come up with a cirrhosis claim. I think there are too many players right now in mid-stage development to get a clear handle on who will be next into phase 3 and, who's particularly showing development. If you held my feet to the fire, I'd say that Inventiva, Sirius, and NGM could be ones to watch as they near their phase 2b data readouts. I would always keep an eye on Novartis and Gilead simply because of their critical mass, and I should probably add Pfizer and Boehringer Ingelheim there as well. When we think about how the standard of care in NASH will evolve, it's going to move toward combination therapy. That will mimic the evolution we saw both in hepatitis C and also HIV. And there it's instructive to note that Gilead took a dominant position with combination therapy in both of those spaces. And so because of that, despite their clinical setbacks so far in NASH, I think a lot of people look at them as the quote-unquote 800-pound gorilla in the room in this indication. So Gilead, Pfizer, Novartis, and Boehringer Ingelheim are among the companies pursuing combination strategies. This is both in-house and with partners. Intercept has said it hopes Ocaliva will be a backbone therapy for NASH combination therapy, and it's already begun its own combination efforts. It has acquired a PPAR agonist called bezafibrate. Of course, that's the same mechanism as in Genfit's elafibranor, and they're also going to be testing Ocaliva with GLP-1, THR-beta agonist, and FGF21 agents. And they have said that it's their hope that Ocaliva will end up being like metformin for diabetes. Genfit also aspires to be the backbone of future combination therapy, and they are internally exploring combining elafibranor with the GLP-1 and SGLT2 classes. When I spoke with Genfit's CEO a few weeks ago, he explained to me that they think their label claim for NASH resolution will make more sense as a backbone agent than the fibrosis reduction claim that Intercept hopes to have. We'll see how that plays out. Now, I mentioned before the Novartis-Pfizer collaboration, which is looking into teaming up Novartis's FXR agonist, and again, that's the mechanism of action in Intercept's Ocaliva, with Pfizer's ACC, DGAT2, and ketohexokinase inhibitors. And that last, the KHK inhibitor, is a first-in-class agent, and those are all fat-reducing mechanisms. Lastly, Yuhan and Boehringer Ingelheim are partnered on a dual GLP-1 FGF21 candidate. So that's another possible thing to watch for in combination therapy. So now as we advance to our conclusions, Hannah, do you have a conclusion you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So it's clear that there's huge untapped potential in the NASH market, as there's a significant unmet need due to the high clinical and economic burden and the high market size that is increasing in prevalence. However, the current pipeline has experienced modest efficacy results, predominantly due to the complicated and multifactorial pathophysiology of the disease, which has likely contributed to multiple trial failures.
I'll add that my conclusions are that this space continues to be ever evolving in terms of R&D advancements and business development. Intercept's expected approval for Ocaliva next year will be much more of a starting point than any sort of an ending for this space. And I expect this space somewhat to mirror the constant upheaval we saw in Hep C between 2011 and 2016. I also think that Novartis seems like an especially committed deal maker in this space, and I would look for them perhaps to begin pushing toward the front of the pack, despite the disappointment of their Tobira deal and the terminated development of Emricasan. They seem sharply focused on playing a key role in the development of a standard of care combination regimen with their various deals.
So ultimately, pricing strategies will determine the ease of patient accessibility of NASH therapies. And as companies are expected to initially strive for a high premium price, they have to understand that they will be faced with strict reimbursement criteria, which will limit patient accessibility. So Joe, now could you please just wrap up for us?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I hope this has been informative and interesting for our audience. I'll once again mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to both the recording and the slides will be sent to all registrants after the webinar. Also, if you have follow-up questions for us, and this particular course are people who aren't listening live but are listening to a recording, please feel free to send us questions at pharma@informa.com. And at this point, that wraps up our presentation today. And Hannah and I both thank you for joining us.